Probably like the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life happened. Some guy like made a Reddit account so that he could make posts on Reddit debunking my tweets on imperialism. Debunking tweets on imperialism. If that's not funny enough by itself, looking at the actual posts is a fucking riot. And I think it's a really good opportunity actually to talk about a thing that a lot of people do, which is they really have very little understanding of how to critically analyze anything. Basically, they don't know how to think at all. But they do know how to make like these sorts of like vague appeals to like academia without actually really proving or even really engaging with academia at all, engaging with its debates, engaging with like historiography, engaging with anything really. But they know how to like look at a Wikipedia article and like read an abstract. So they think like read the abstract of like the first thing that pops up on like a Google Scholar search that they think says what they wanted to say. So they think like they're incredibly confident and they think like they're some sort of like scholarly gods or something. Like just look at the thing this guy posted. Like I replied to him because everything he was saying was incredibly funny. Like he came in and like posted like replying to me. And this is a fucking awesome opportunity to like just provide an example of this sort of thing. He's like, I've already debunked your awful tweets on imperialism here the way I said I would with academic sources. And he's just like saying, these sources are scholarly. Okay. Have you read them? And this one is the funniest one. Go ahead and try to have a field day with my exhaustively researched post utilizing dozens of high-quality scholarly sources, arguing for a position that is perfectly in line with the scholarly consensus. And like, if you Google this guy's name, he thinks he's a socialist streamer. I found his Twitch the other day. He thinks he's a socialist. His Twitch says, I am a socialist streamer. Provocative leftist. And he's like defending neoliberalism here. So like, for one, he fails at kind of the first hurdle here. He responds, debunking BadEmpanada's tweets on imperialism, like, the premise here is so funny. Debunking tweets on imperialism. Final draft to be shared on subreddits. Oh my god, like the way that he's referring to this, he's acting like he's just finished like an academic article and he's about to submit it to journals. It's so funny. But anyway, let's look at the actual substance. Recently, the YouTuber BadEmpanada made a series of tweets complaining about so-called imperialism. BadEmpanada uses the Leninist definition of imperialism, which unsurprisingly is not used by any serious historians or economists. That's already wrong at the first hurdle. For one, economists just don't really talk about imperialism in the first place. For obvious reasons, right? They don't want you to know that it exists. But historians absolutely do use the Leninist definition of imperialism constantly. Like, did you check this before talking? One of the most revered historians ever, probably the most revered historian of the last century was Eric Hobsbawm, who used the Leninist definition of imperialism constantly. It's just completely nonsensical. Why don't we search like fucking Google Scholar for like Lenin imperialism? The work itself has only been, or this specific version of it, has only been cited 5,000 times. You know, no one uses it. Hobsbawm definitely never uses it. Basically just falling at the first hurdle, like just saying what he thinks things are like and just assuming that's what they're like without even actually checking. For one, like, I don't think that serious historians, so-called, are really concerned about specifically branding things as imperialism or not. That's not really a question that people have. Lenin's definition of imperialism is more just a framework of analysis that is absolutely used by many serious historians, okay? Like, there's not like imperialism studies where people go around asking the question, is this thing imperialist or not? And he says here, unfortunately, BadEmpanada does not have any experience in economics. I literally have multiple videos specifically dealing with economics. And the truth is that there is an overwhelming scholarly consensus based on dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of peer-reviewed academic papers that the thing that BE would consider to be imperialism or associated with imperialism in developing countries, free trade, globalization, strong property rights, and a business-friendly environment, have been shown to be very positive for developing countries. One, that's not what imperialism is. Imperialism is not when neoliberalism. I don't understand how the fuck this guy could possibly come to that conclusion. Imperialism existed before neoliberalism existed. Before the neoliberal dogma became dominant. Lenin wrote his definition of imperialism about 60 years before any country ever implemented anything that could remotely be called neoliberalism. So this is just nonsensical. China, for example, instituted limited privatization of the economy and this so-called opening up to trade, which, by the way, is not explicitly neoliberal in of itself, without at least direct imperialist forces forcing them to do it, for example. Maybe there is a correlation between these policies when they're forced and imperialism, but it's completely possible. Or at least as a global system, you could argue, yeah, there's pressure from the global the capitalist global system to force countries to integrate into the capitalist global system, which is definitely a facet of imperialism. But you can't specifically argue this was due to like direct imperialist intervention, what I would specifically argue when I talk about imperialism in a more direct sense. But let's see what he brings up for this overwhelming scholarly consensus. Now, first, the so-called overwhelming scholarly consensus in economics is pretty much just in the UK and the US. Obviously, when you have a bunch of economics departments, which are, in fact, I've gone over this in my video on neoliberalism, by the way. You have a bunch of economics departments which are primarily funded by donations from businesses, whose primary objective has been to essentially justify the economic shift ever since the economic shift happens. That's why they swapped from Keynesianism to neoliberalism, which happened because specifically beginning with the University of Chicago and the London Institute of Economics, from which it spread to the rest of the world. And yeah, there are a lot of this, like him saying this is like a settled science or something makes no sense. There's plenty of arguments about this still. The World Bank or the IMF, one of those, so I think it was the IMF, released a paper like 5 years ago where they specifically said that the whole free trade, the whole globalization as a dogma thing has been vastly overstated. There are plenty of highly regarded economists who are not neoliberals. Like Piketty, for his flaws, is obviously still a capitalist, and he's very well regarded among economists. So this guy is just like appealing to a vague consensus that, according to him, is unassailable, without engaging with the arguments themselves, without even remotely touching the counter arguments, and without even providing any evidence of this consensus. This is exactly like like a liberal taking a dogma as fact without even looking into it for themselves. This is pretty much the epitome of pseudo-intellectualism, if it can even be called that. I think it doesn't even come close, it doesn't even really try. So the first source that he provides: much research has been conducted on poverty, which has gone down across the board in an era where the world should be poorer than ever. Just how widespread so-called imperialism is. That makes no sense, for one, because imperialism was far worse before this present era of imperialism. We literally had direct colonization. Up until like the 60s and 70s, there was direct global European colonization. I think it's safe to say that imperialism was worse then than it is now, even though it's still obviously very bad. What the fuck is he talking about? So like, of course, would the world get better after a bunch of countries are released from the clutches of a foreign power and finally given the chance to govern themselves? Yes, I would say so, regardless of what sort of policies they follow, just based on the fact that they aren't so directly being ruled by a foreign power anymore, even though they're obviously still being exploited in a lot of cases. That alone is going to result in improvement. So we already have a massive fallacy at the beginning here. The world is factually less imperialist today than it was 70 or 80 years ago. And that is because of in many cases, communist-led struggles against colonization, primarily. And he says, no matter what poverty line you choose, the share of people below the poverty line has declined globally. Now, what they're using here is essentially a bunch of IMF poverty lines, which do not account for anything local. Now, I would like to ask you a question. Could you live on $2 a day? In very few countries in the world, you could live on $2 a day. In very few countries in the world, could you live on $20 a day? In some countries, probably like a little less than half, you could live on $5 a day. In many more, $10 a day. Still, maybe around half. Above $10 a day, which is a very low bar, still not very many. So we have a poverty line being applied internationally, right? Without using direct price indexes, rather using purchasing power parity, which just makes an assumption based off GDP without really thoroughly engaging with a multidimensional poverty index for the subject countries. So for one, his idea of imperialism makes no sense. And for two, his justification of imperialism doesn't make any sense either, because less people living on $1 a day, living on $3 a day, living on $5 a day, living on $10 a day, etc., says fucking nothing. It doesn't say anything about what can these people buy with this. How are they actually living? Do they have a house? Do they have good education? Do they have good healthcare? Are they starving? Are they on the brink? Are they like living paycheck to paycheck, as they call it? This answers nothing. To ask questions about poverty, the only way that you can, and by the way, a lot of the data here is just wrong. A lot of the data is pretty much non-existent. We'll go over that. There's a great Economics Explained segment where he basically explains this. So, all of these poverty lines are completely invalid. They're not actually poverty lines. They're just gross income lines, basically, which means nothing, because they say nothing about how much this can actually buy for you in your local economy. If you want an actual, real, meaningful measure of whether people now can buy more than they did before the era of neoliberalism, which is what we're talking about here. We're not talking about neoliberalism. We're not talking about imperialism. We're just talking about neoliberalism, which I'm fine to do. This is very easy to refute as well. You need to look at real wages.
Communism is based.
Real wages have not gone up almost anywhere in the world. In very few places have they, since the era of neoliberalism. I think it's fair, firstly, that we look at, let's look at countries that have factually been victims of US imperialism during this time period. US imposed neoliberal measures, specifically actual unambiguous imperialism. So Latin American countries where US supported dictatorships implemented neoliberal policies by force in no way that could possibly be argued as democratically from the early 70s onwards. Let's take a look. The countries being looked at here are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, free countries where US dictatorships were specifically installed at the behest of the USA to implement neoliberal policies. Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, which did go neoliberal, less coerced, but still they went neoliberal under a lot of pressure from foreign capital, which obviously involved facets of imperialism. Let's check real wages. So we have average real wage is this blue bar, the blue line. Unskilled real wage is the yellow line. As you can see here, we have a peak in the very early 70s, followed by another slight rise in the early 80s across all of these Latin American countries, then a sharp decline, followed by just bare recovery to the peak. So what we have here is that before the era of neoliberalism, the real wage was, for all intents and purposes, equal to what it is now. What that means is what you're earning isn't actually more than it was back then. This is the same exact thing in the USA. This has not just affected imperialized countries, but also the USA, which has neoliberalism imposed, obviously not through imperialism, but through its own government. Same in the UK. Let's look at real wages versus productivity in the US. Very, very well-known graph. You cannot talk about this without dealing with this. Post-Reagan, real wages barely increase. Productivity goes way up. What that clearly indicates is, in the neoliberal era, and by the way, productivity hasn't actually gone up. It's basically been going up at the exact same rate as it was before, but real wages have stopped going up with it. So what this means is that there is stagnation in wages while productivity has not seen any real benefit. So basically what neoliberal reforms have done here, and this is reproduced in India too, an imperialized country, and I'm going to go over that soon, exactly the same graph. You can see it in India as well. What this shows is that neoliberal policies essentially end up appropriating more money from the workers than what they were making beforehand and giving it to capital. That's what this means. That's literally what this gap represents. More money going to the bourgeoisie. Let's look at India, exact same graph, which is a country that this guy specifically cites, and I'll show you. He cites this as an example of a country that has apparently benefited greatly. He says here, China, India, and Bangladesh were once extremely poor companies, but after opening up to markets and getting rid of central planning and embracing the dreaded sweatshops, their economies grew massively. What does that mean? What does it mean when GDP goes up? I don't care if GDP goes up. I care about the conditions of human beings. The average human being in India cannot buy any more now than they could in the 80s. Okay? This is a fact. Real wages in India. By the way, if India is the crown fucking jewel of globalism or whatever, 80% of the labor force continues to be in the informal sector with no job security or protective labor legislation. Fucking awesome, dude. Let's take a look at India, which has benefited massively. I mean, it's benefited massively, sure. It's benefited massively in generating capital for corporations, most of them foreign. It hasn't benefited the lives of human beings very much. Real productivity has been going up in India. Just look at this graph. Has been going up in India. Pretty much on a similar pattern to how it was during the supposed... I don't think India was anywhere near a central plan as this guy says, but let's give him that anyway. Since the 80s, productivity has been going up. Real wages are literally at the exact same point as they were in 1982. They have not increased at all. It's a complete flat line. What that means is the average Indian cannot buy any more today with their wages than what they could buy earlier. What that means is, essentially, things for them are exactly the same. Practically exactly the same. For all intents and purposes, exactly the same. Yeah, India was never centrally planned. That's a ridiculous thing to state. India as a country has basically been it's been anarcho-capitalism almost. India is a country where, as it says here, 90% of workers are informal. What that means is basically it's the wild fucking West, at least metaphorically. You guys know I don't like to use that. I shouldn't have used that phrase, but people understand what I mean by that, right? There's basically no real regulation because most economic activity is completely informal. And it's still fucked up. It's still stricken with massive abject poverty. So look, this guy has failed completely on the first hurdle. He cites like World Bank poverty line, which doesn't take anything local into account. It doesn't take anything regarding actual human welfare into account. Makes no sense at all. It's really stupid. Like, it's literally number go up, world more gooder. Let's see what else he cites. No matter what poverty line you go down drastically, millions of people have been pulled from poverty and destitution. Pulled from poverty and destitution. Meanwhile, their material circumstances are practically exactly the same. Some claim this was only in China. However, that is also false. He just you notice how he just links a thing without actually engaging with it at all. Let's look at his actual source for that being supposedly false. If we look at the source, right, an absolutely massive fucking amount of this comes from China. You see here, the starting rate for the world, not including China. This is, by the way, this is according to that exact same completely invalid, like $1, $3, $5 a day poverty line, which isn't actually a real poverty line. You look at this, it goes from 29% to 12% according to this if you don't include China. But in China included, it goes from 49% to 10%. That is such a massive fucking difference. Like, if you want to talk about poverty reducing, you want to talk about material conditions improving over time, you can look at, for example, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union experienced massive fucking growth from 1928 to 1970, for example. You know, number went up. Does that mean that, like, is this like objective proof that the Soviet system is like especially good or something? According to this guy's logic, it should be. So I guess I just made an irrefutable argument because number went up without considering any other factors. There's a great paper, I think it's a book actually, that specifically discusses GDP growth, at least estimated GDP growth. Another thing this guy doesn't apparently know is that GDP growth is estimated. None of these are actually objective. All GDP growth is completely estimated. Essentially, it's a crapshoot based off very limited data. Up until like the 70s or the 80s, most countries didn't actually do any sort of real quality accounting in this way. So you can't actually do this comparison. Now, Economics Explained has gone over this, and I want to play that segment here, just before we move on, before I forget to do it. I actually wanted to make a video on this exact subject because, yes, I do study a lot of economics, but he beat me to the punch and I just decided it was not worth it when he's already basically covered everything that I wanted to cover. Not Economics Explained, but Economics Unexplained or whatever, Unlearning Economics, I'm so sorry. Wrong guy, I called him by the fucking neoliberal guy's name, I'm sorry. This is the one that I meant. Don't look at Economics Explained, look at this guy, Unlearning Economics. And he deals with this ridiculous China talking point, which is very funny. He really dissects how bad these arguments regarding China are. Okay, first let's watch this part, then we'll watch another part.
His response to Hickel on this point revealed a lot. The political agenda of Hickel and other far leftists is obvious. It's humiliating to their worldview that the data show massive improvements due to markets and globalization, rather than an overthrow of capitalism and global redistribution. Pinker also insisted he was siding with the experts and accused Hickel of being a Marxist ideologue. Whether you agree with Hickel or not, he is an expert on the poverty data, and ultimately Pinker was unable to engage on the detail.
You say widely accepted, but this is my point. You don't acknowledge in the book, there's no caveats where you say, for example, Professor Lant Pritchett, Harvard colleague of yours, a development economist who studies this stuff, says the poverty line shouldn't be $1.90, it should be $12, $15 a day. And when you make that simple statistical change, the entire picture of poverty changes, and the arguments in your book basically fall apart, do they not?
Wow. Do you see how easy it is to refute this dumb fucking shit where people just point to a line going up in an arbitrarily chosen poverty line that doesn't make any fucking sense at all? Like, come on.
No, I don't think so. Again, I mean, maybe by...
And Unlearning Economics goes into further detail here on excluding China specifically.
Change. This is the problem of relying on data. You change the measurement and everything changes.
Well, no, not everything changes because, I mean, there can be, I mean, that's a rather extreme redefinition. That's multiplying by a factor of 6.
Oh, he's one of the world's experts on the subject.
Well,
you're
yes,
not,
so,
with respect.
It's multiplying it by a factor of 6? Yeah, why not? Do you think people can live on $1.90 a day? In most countries in the world, they definitely cannot. Are you fucking insane? How is that a better poverty line than $15? It's not.
His field. You could have included the caveats and said, look, there's a bunch of experts who don't agree that poverty is falling. You declare it as fact that poverty is falling. Plenty of development experts disagree with you, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, some do, but if it's a question of just absolute numbers, it's irrelevant. If it's a question of whether we should set the poverty level at $2 or $3, that's irrelevant. Over a wide range of estimates, the picture is the same.
Omitting China doesn't change the trend at lower poverty lines like $1.90, but as China has made the most promising progress at higher poverty lines, omitting it means even the proportion of people in poverty at higher lines has been roughly stagnant.
Do you see that? Change it to $7.40 a day, remove China. Poverty is exactly the same. What you clearly see here is that when you omit China, which is definitely not a liberal sort of free market economy in any respect with a good business environment or whatever, China, even after its reforms, is still has a very highly regulated economy with a principal role given to state-owned corporations that basically does whatever it wants to corporations when they annoy the government. It's definitely not a neoliberal state in any way, shape, or form, and engaging in global trade doesn't make it neoliberal. Every country wants to engage in trade with as many countries as it's convenient to them. China, or even any socialist country like Cuba would like to, for example. That's not what neoliberalism is. It's not voluntarily engaging in trade. But like China, which is definitely not a neoliberal free market country in any respect, you remove it, and you don't do these fucking games where you take a poverty line that literally most people in the world would be dead trying to live on. You don't do that, and your narrative falls apart, even using these incredibly reductive, just blanket global poverty lines which don't even account for local conditions in any way, shape, or form. But the thing with global poverty lines in general is that they don't work. They're incredibly reductive. Poverty lines need to account for things like local prices, rent prices, access to education, access to healthcare, food access to adequate housing. You can't just take a fucking a reductive number and apply it to the entire world. Every country has different price conditions, different levels of social welfare programs, different levels of social guarantees. You can't just take a number and apply it to a country. And just before we move on, I wanted to mention Argentina's multidimensional poverty index, which is very good. It's the best one in the world, I think. It's one of the only ones that are actually used officially, I think. Because in most countries, real poverty index, real actual poverty indexes that account for things like prices, what it actually really genuinely costs for someone to get by, are very inconvenient. So they instead go for very reductive income-based poverty, like percentage of average income-based poverty indexes, which don't actually tell you anything about how people are doing materially. The Argentine one is still flawed in that it assumes that, hold on, I'll bring it up to give you an example. So Argentina, if you look at the official poverty rate, it's generally higher than 20%. Right now, it's like 35, 40%. But if Argentina instead measured poverty in a simple way based on nothing more than average income, it would be much lower. It's because basically the government is more honest, so it looks worse. While other countries are less honest, they look better. That's why they don't use indexes like this to avoid looking bad. But the way that they measure poverty in Argentina, they send like people out to do a price survey in every single province of like 5,000 people, a representative sample, and survey them on how much they earn, like their perceptions of how much they need to get by, stuff like that, and adjust it accordingly. And then based on that, they come up with something called like a basic family basket, I guess, which is a much more objective measure of like what different groups of people would need to get by in different locations too. Far more detailed and honest than any, it actually measures like how much people can buy with the money that they earn. How much they need to earn to be able to get by. The only issue with it is that it doesn't account for rent. Other than that, it's the best in the world. Though there's not, honestly, compared to income-based poverty measures, it's fucking a million times better. At the cost of that, Argentina looks worse than other countries just because its poverty line is more honest. See, this is like, you can't compare poverty between countries, and you certainly can't compare because they all use different measures and they all have different circumstances, different prices, etc. And you certainly can't compare them in a way that like just taking a reductive dollar number, that's absurd, and applying it to all of them equally without even accounting for prices or any like differences in social programs, actual material conditions in any way, shape, or form. Let's see what else this guy has as evidence. Additionally, for example, the world population living in slums has gone down by 10% in the last 20 years alone. That's a worthless statistic because there's no data from before that, so you can't actually compare it to how things were before. Very simple. Another thing is that neoliberalization, or at least globalization, has drove construction of slum housing in the first place because it encourages people to move from the countryside to the cities where they need housing. And many of them, when they're just starting out, and for many of them for longer periods, need to get housing. So they live in fucking slums. They just build a shack in somewhere, and that gradually becomes a slum. So like this isn't comparing this to anything. There's no point of comparison here. It's just, and this is 30 years, by the way, not 20. So we're not comparing this to anything previously. It just number go down. Not going to talk about the causes. Obviously this is incredibly highly influenced by China, which has a state-led housing program in many respects. And an economy that, as we've just gone over, is not at all neoliberal. Socialist, no, but not at all neoliberal. Not at all free market. And then the last one here in this section is calorie intake has drastically increased across the board in the last 40 years. Calorie intake has drastically increased across the board in the last 100 years. It has to do with the industrialization of farming. Very little to do with anything to do with economic systems. For example, let's look at Russia. Russia, 2013, 3.3 kcal per day. What about Russia, 1965, Soviet Union, 3.2 kcal per day. Barely changed. You know why? Because Russia had industrialized its farming in the previous 30 years or so. Once your farming sector is well industrialized, there's really not much room left to increase the amount of food consumption in your country, aside from imports, which in basically most of these countries provide their own food, except some small island nations that are relying on imports because they don't have enough arable land. We can also look at Cuba. Cuba in the same period. 1965 is their earlier statistics. Cuba in 1961, soon after the revolution, 2.1 kcal per day. Cuba in 2013, 3.4 kcal per day. What's going on here is, as I said, better farming practices in the industrialization of farming, better yields in general. It has absolutely nothing to do with so-called neoliberalization at all. You can look at Argentina, for example. Argentina's food consumption peaked in the Peronist era, which was obviously not free market capitalist. 1946, 3.2 kilocalories per day. 2013, 3.2 practically exactly the same. It hasn't changed at all, despite going through about 20 to 30 years of neoliberalization under the US-supported dictatorship and the 10-year-long disastrous Vladimir Menem, Carlos Menem presidency. Like, he's just attributing this to nothing, basically. Even though clearly the correlation doesn't work, because in the Soviet Union, the same thing happened, right? In Cuba, the same thing happened. In Vietnam, barely anything's changed either. Let's look at Vietnam, for example. 1979, 1.9 per day. Vietnam, well, it has gone up pretty substantially. Obviously, because the fucking war ended. Both war with China and the US and with Cambodia. Another thing is that I want to go to as well. Economics explained in his video that a lot of these statistics are just bullshit. We do not have good economics explained. I keep saying economics explained. Unlearning economics. Fuck, I'm sorry for insulting you by saying that you're that guy, man. Because the fact of the matter is that there's not even good statistics for GDP per capita for poverty in the vast majority of countries in the world, so you just can't compare them adequately. It's no coincidence that in like the first fucking era where we actually have decent statistics, they happen to show things going up. But at the same time, real wages haven't gone up, material conditions haven't gotten better, except in China, which is not a free market economy. Here.
I also have my suspicions that we might be facing the same problem we had with the earlier data, the underestimation of non-market consumption. If people were doing better than we thought before modern capitalism, then obviously the gains from transitioning to capitalism will be overstated. Modern estimates are much better at
And another thing. GDP per capita historically does not account for basically any transaction that the state doesn't really have a record of, right? Informal transactions or like trading non-monetary trade, like trading something for something else. So as like economies become more formalized, GDP per capita calculations vastly overestimate how low the GDP per capita was before and how much the improvement is. Because a lot of that improvement isn't actually improvement, it's just people being brought into the formal sector, the actually GDP counted sectors of the economy.
Accounting for this than the GDP ones used for historical data that we saw earlier. But in some cases, the number of people recorded in extreme poverty by these measures defies credulity. The chairman of Kenya's National Bureau of Statistics once said that if the official data were right, and 72% of Kenyans lived on $1 or $2 a day, then 72% of my people are dead.
Exactly. This is what these fucking Western neoliberals don't get. You cannot live on $1 a day but the vast majority of places in the world. Only the most destitute places that are destitute because of imperialism, by the way. Only in those places can you live on $1 a day. So to use those sorts of random arbitrary dollar amounts as the poverty line is fucking hilarious.
Andrew Fisher has argued that the graph implies the overwhelming majority of Chinese people in the 1970s were only just getting 2,000 calories a day on average, when at the time they were farmers engaged in demanding manual labour and would have required at least half of that again. While China in the 19...
Exactly. If you work in manual labor, like 8-10 hours a day, working in farming, manual labor, subsistence farming or whatever, and you're only at 2,000 a day, you're going to fucking die. Obviously that's wrong. Again, this is someone who is not critical about what they read. They Google things that seem to correlate with what I believe, and they post them with no context at all, without engaging with them at all. And this is the trap of that. This person is a complete moron. But let's go on. Oh my god, he cited another GDP per capita. It's literally, later on he cites GDP per capita again. GDP per capita go up, world more gooder. As I've shown, this hasn't trickled down to the working class. Their wages are the same. Yeah, this is a first page Google searcher. Like I already refuted this part earlier. And he says, property rights and economic freedom. This guy thinks he's a leftist socialist, by the way. This is hilarious. Well, one major factor is the lack of economic freedom and property rights. Things have improved quicker than ever in human history in this area of globalization. Things have improved quicker than ever in human history. They haven't. We do not have any even remotely actionable accounting for previous eras in human history. This is also correlated with tons of other things. The USSR, for example, saw similar levels of improvements during a similar time frame. This is also the age of decolonization. Like 70, 80 countries around the world are ruling themselves for the first time ever. Like, there's so many correlations here, and this guy is attributed it to like one specific correlation that only began in the 70s, that taken on its own, when you actually examine it like on a country level, on a specific level in regards to statistics such as real wages, things got worse. So he cites here, I don't even know why. This has nothing to do with imperialism. This is about just neoliberalism, which isn't specifically imperialism. I don't even know why I'm responding to this idiotic stuff. It doesn't even deal with anything. It doesn't even directly reference a single thing that I said, by the way. Responding to tweets. Well, one major factor is the lack of economic freedom and property rights. One meta-analysis looked at over 400 studies, and the majority of them found that economic freedom was correlated with good outcomes. What is a good outcome? This proves that a business-friendly environment is indeed very important for higher living standards. This guy is a leftist socialist. This is fucking amazing. Good outcomes and bad outcomes. Wow, let's check it out. This is paywalled. So, let's read this up. Economic Freedom of the World and Accounting of the Literature. The Economic Freedom of the World Index. Let's Google that. Let's see who makes that. Who maintains this index? An annual survey published by the Canadian think tank, the Fraser Institute. The Fraser Institute is a conservative and libertarian Canadian public policy think tank. Wow! I'm shocked that the index created by a conservative and libertarian think tank says what they want it to say. I cannot believe that. I absolutely cannot believe that. But let's look at the content of this article, right? Let's see what good outcomes and bad outcomes actually are. So I'm going to have to do a bit of a sneaky beaky here, off screen, because this article isn't freely available. By the way, this guy didn't read the article, because he's just linking the abstract. This guy read the abstract on this article and then just linked it. Okay, this article is not an analysis of what this guy says it is. It is an analysis of 402 articles that have cited this conservative think tank's Economic Freedom of the World Index. Basically, it's arguing that this index is good academically because it's been cited sometimes. Over 2/3 of these studies found economic freedom correspond to good outcomes, such as faster growth. As we've gone over, that doesn't really mean anything in terms of people living standards. And then it says better living standards. Oh, let's look at that. More happiness. You can't measure more happiness. You literally can't measure that. Wow, less than 4% of the sample found economic freedom to be associated with bad outcomes, such as increased income inequality. It literally is correlated. The neoliberal era of the world has resulted in just an astronomical concentration of the world's wealth. Let's look, like fast 40 years, concentration of the world's wealth. So obviously this just goes against everything to do with reality. Income concentration at the top has sharply risen since the 70s. You see this? That's the Great Depression. The Great Depression peaked 25% in the hands of the top 1%. Then it went down to about 10%. Then in the era of neoliberalization, it went way, way up. Factually, the era of neoliberalization has coincided with a massive increase in income and inequality and a massive increase in the concentration of wealth in the top. So obviously, this article trying to say that it hasn't increased income inequality is obviously absurd. It factually has. Let's read the article. Let's actually engage. It cites Milton Friedman. Let's actually engage with the fucking content. Let's check. Have their living standards improved? Let's see. It just states here, some of these things are associated with some of these articles which it says found good outcomes, such as increased living standards. Okay. But it doesn't actually mention, I'm interested in that because that's actually material proof, right? But there's nothing. They don't actually cite living standards. Yeah, they don't, there's no actually citation for that. They say that they looked at articles that prove that living standards have increased, but they don't actually cite any of them. Let's look at the articles that they cited. They do have a list, or at least a selected list. Okay, got to rotate. Where's the rotate button? Where's the rotate button? Fucking, there we go. Rotate. Let's check out what these articles have been cited in. Most of these articles have literally nothing to do with anything regarding human living standards or anything. Economic growth, just like random economic growth, nothing to do with anything. Has literally no, economic growth in of itself has nothing to do with living standards, as we've just gone over in regards to real wages. Economic freedom and the impact on technology and productivity, freedom and international migration. A lot of these are just like from citation of the World Bank, citing literal business journals, the Journal of Happiness Studies. Wonder if like any of these it's good for business, because that's basically what these indexes are created for. Citation from the Journal of World Business found that economic freedom, or whatever this guy thinks economic freedom is good. I would never suspect it. Wow. The International Business Review found good outcomes. I would have thought of that. Who would have thought that the free market is better for corporate profits? I never would have thought of that. This is probably the dumbest article I've ever seen. That this guy cited it without even reading it. He just Google searched and went for the first thing he saw. It's absurd. That's it. All of these statements that things have improved since the 70s are categorically false when you look at actual human welfare. Categorically false. And I went over that. Based on all of the measures this guy cited, we went over that. Oh, by the way, he says that sweatshops are good. Fucking incredible. Factually, when you look at real wages, sweatshops have not increased wages for anyone. All they've done is move workers into the industrial sector, where they're possibly even more exploited than they were before. And he says here, conclusion. I have shown how BadEmpanada and other critics of globalization are actively working against the interests of the working class in the developing world. My advice is to just ignore people like this. One look at the data destroys their entire argument. This is what happens when you don't know how to do critical analysis, when you just don't know what you're talking about, when you fundamentally lack basic critical thinking skills. He's incredibly confident, but just embarrassingly wrong and embarrassingly easy to prove wrong. Incapable of actually thinking about how he thinks, thinking about the data, actually critically examining the data rather than just being like, line go up, thing happen that roughly correlates with line go up, world more gooder. That's literally the level of logic that this guy engaged in. It's hilarious. He made another post too. I might respond to it on another stream, but for now, that was exhausting. It's honestly hilarious. I think that's an excellent example of how not to think. I implore all of you to not be that guy. Think about how you think. Think about how the data that you look at was gathered, where it comes from, if it really correlates with what you're thinking of. Look at more than like GDP go up, world more gooder. More people have $1, world more gooder. Without thinking about how this actually relates to anything remotely material. The fact of the matter is that all of us in most of the world, we are worse off than our parents were. We are worse off than our grandparents were in terms of our material conditions. And that is fucking sad. If you live in the US, for example, your wage roughly buys the same as what your parents' wage did, but it buys less premium goods, such as cars and houses. So you functionally earn less because you have to pay rent, whereas your parents did it. Same thing with increasing university prices, etc. You cannot say that the world has gotten better in the last 50 years. It factually has not. Corporate profit has increased, but that doesn't mean the world has gotten better. And this guy's like, he doesn't know about economics. He doesn't know about anything. It's just a random like 14-year-old skimming Google, like just blindly repeating the completely ridiculous dogma and the most easily refutable talking points regarding this to back up this dogma imaginable. But still somehow he's so confident in himself that he just ends up coming off as a parody. It's absurd. Anyway, my head hurts from that shit. That's so fucking dumb, and he's so confident about it. Like, let's look at like the initial thing that he said. So fucking funny. Go ahead and try to have a field day with my exhaustively researched post utilizing dozens of high-quality scholarly sources and arguing for a position that is perfectly in line with the scholarly consensus. This is a completely empty appeal to authority, not even real authority, an imagined authority, a consensus that he does not prove in any way. He referenced one single academic article, and there was like a fucking literature review that was trying to prove that conservative right-wing libertarian think tanks' hilariously stupid economic freedom index is good because it's been cited in a bunch of business journals. That was his one academic citation. I cannot fucking believe it. That someone like this could possibly say this. This is pseudo-intellectualism. It's nothing. There's no capacity for engagement. This is why you need an actual honest education. You need to be real about getting your real education. It's possible to educate yourself in this way. You don't need to go to university, but it is harder. This guy's a fucking parody. Hilarious. I thank him for giving me amazing content.